Deep beneath Earth's surface, a war is being waged. It's a battle between two powerful tectonic forces, one that builds mountains and another that tears them down. And now scientists may have uncovered an even more destructive hidden player. Hi, it's me, and this is Minute Metaphor. Now we know that Earth's outer layer isn't just one big solid slab. Instead, it's made up of lots of smaller pieces called tectonic plates that are in constant motion. When these plates meet, they can crash into each other, and the denser plate will sink down into the planet at a so-called subduction zone. But there's also another kind of boundary called a transform fault, where the plates slide past each other horizontally. The San Andreas Fault in California is an example of a transform fault. These boundaries between moving plates help drive the cycle of mountain building and mountain destruction. At subduction zones, the sinking of the dense plate releases energy that partly melts the mantle, the thick layer of rock between the crust and the core. That partially melted material, called magma, is less dense than the surrounding solid mantle, so it rises up toward Earth's surface. As it makes its way upward, the pressure decreases and more of the mantle material melts, creating even more magma, which adds to the growing molten pool. Eventually, there's so much magma that it breaks through the crust and erupts as lava, building up new land. So the sinking of the dense plate at the subduction zone creates magma that builds up mountains. Meanwhile, at the transform faults, friction is really high because the rocks are sliding past each other. All that friction generates heat that causes the rocks to become brittle and fracture, breaking them apart and wearing them down. So, transform faults destroy mountains. For a long time, scientists thought these two opposing forces were the main players in shaping big mountain ranges like the Cascades and the Andes. But recently, researchers started to suspect that something else was going on in these regions, something that could make Earth's deadliest volcanoes and whose influence extends way beyond the boundaries of tectonic plates. They named this mysterious force the engine of fire. But instead of adding fuel to the fire, this engine starts with plumes of rock deep within the mantle. Just like magma, this rock is hotter than the surrounding mantle, but it's not quite melted yet. Geologists call these hot rock plumes mantle plumes. And while they're usually not hot enough to melt their way up through the entire mantle and onto Earth's surface, they can still push up toward the crust. In some places, when the plume reaches the crust, it stays there, melting its way laterally through the crust and creating magma that erupts as lava. In other places, the plume actually melts its way up through the crust. Either way, it builds up magma, which erupts as lava, building up mountains. Scientists had previously identified mantle plumes as the force behind isolated mountain chains that aren't near any plate boundaries, like Hawaii. But until recently, they couldn't say for sure whether mantle plumes play any role in building up the mountains along the edges of tectonic plates. To figure out if they do, a team of researchers led by geologist Michael Poland at the U.S. Geological Survey turned to the Cascade volcanic arc in the Pacific Northwest. This arc contains about 70 volcanoes, including Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. Now we know that the Cascades exist because of the subduction zone that's located just offshore. Hot mantle material from the subduction zone melts and recools as it makes its way up toward the surface, creating the magma that fuels volcanic eruptions and builds up the mountain range. But how much of the melting is due to the subduction zone versus the engine of fire? To answer that question, Poland and his team needed to understand the chemistry of the magma that fuels the Cascades. Magma forms when rock melts, but different kinds of rock melt at different temperatures. So by figuring out the chemistry of the magma, the team could work backward to figure out what kind of rock it came from. And to do that, they needed to collect fresh samples of magma. So in 2021, after a year of preparation, the team traveled to the remote wilderness of central Oregon to Mount Bachelor, an active volcano in the Cascades and one of the team's main study sites. They spent 2 weeks drilling into the crater to extract a cylindrical core of solid rock. Once they got back to the lab, they analyzed the composition of the rock and found that it came from the lower mantle, much deeper than the crust. Specifically, they found that the magma formed from a rock called peridotite, which is mostly made of the minerals olivine and pyroxene, and they determined that the magma formed at a depth of about 290 kilometers below the surface and a temperature of around 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit or 1870 degrees Celsius. To figure out what part of the Earth system was hot enough to create those conditions, the team compared their results to published data on the temperature and pressure deep inside the planet. They found that the only place in Earth's interior that's hot enough to create magma with that exact composition is the lower mantle, way down at the boundary between the mantle and the core. So the magma that fuels the Cascades doesn't come from the subduction zone at all. Instead, it comes from deep within the mantle itself, suggesting that mantle plumes play a bigger role in building mountains than scientists previously thought. The team is still working to publish their full findings, but the results they presented at the 2022 American Geophysical Union Fall Meeting suggest that mantle plumes might also be responsible for the magma that fuels other mountain chains along subduction zones, like the Andes and the Mariana Islands. If that's true, then mantle plumes could be a major player in the battle between the mountain builders and the mountain destroyers. But it's not clear yet whether the engine of fire adds fuel to the mountain builders or helps the mountain destroyers. See, when the researchers used computer models to track the journey of a mantle plume from the lower mantle all the way up to the surface, they found that the plume would cool off as it approached the crust. So if the plume is bringing up magma that's fueling the mountain builders, it would need to be extra hot to keep melting its way up. And based on the composition of the magma, the team thinks the plume that fuels the Cascades is hot enough to do that. But the team has yet to analyze the temperatures of individual mantle plumes, so it's not clear whether this is true for all of them, and it's not clear whether they're actually supplying magma to the mountain building process at all. For instance, the team considered the possibility that the plume heats up the surrounding mantle, creating hot spots that make the crust more likely to melt. So the plume wouldn't be building mountains directly, but rather indirectly, by making the crust more likely to supply the magma that does build mountains. To untangle the role of mantle plumes in mountain building, geologists will need to collect more samples of magma from different volcanoes along different plate boundaries. And it'll take several more years of fieldwork to get the samples needed to fully map out the role of mantle plumes in the battle to build or destroy mountains. But the research team hopes that studying these hidden engines of fire will help them better understand the forces that shape our planet and the risks that come with living on top of them. Thanks for watching this episode, which was brought to you with the help of our patrons. If you'd like to help us make videos about cool stuff, you can go to our support page to learn more.